We're going to finish Ruth 1 this morning and hopefully maybe even make it through Ruth 2. Just kind of a little bit of recapitulation. Remember I said that one of the interesting things about Ruth is that the book seems to be something of a voice of dissent in the Old Testament. That is, after having heard how awful the Canaanites are, we now have a Canaanite, more specifically a Moabite, who's sort of like the heroine of this book, and that's Ruth. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to suggest the idea that one of the things that's going on in Ruth is we're actually getting a preview of a number of New Testament themes. So to make that point, right, I want to read to you just a brief episode from Luke's Gospel. So surprise, surprise, whether you were aware of it or not, Gentiles could practice Hesed, right, the covenant-loving faithfulness of God. Surprise, surprise, who knew? So here's a brief story from Luke 7 that makes actually the same point in an equally dramatic way. It's the healing of the centurion's servant in Luke 7. After he'd finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a centurion had a servant who was sick at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. So just remember, right? Centurion, Roman, Gentile, occupying power, bad. Okay, so this is really important that we get the context here. So here's his servant is sick and he was highly valued. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him, earnestly saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation and is one of the ones who built our synagogue." And Jesus went with them. And he was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' as and he does it." When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at it, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." So notice the story there, right? The centurion, as I said, is a Gentile, Roman, occupying power. He apparently is what is sometimes called a God-fearer. That is, someone who kind of has an interest in the synagogue, but hasn't converted yet and probably never will. And so the elders of the synagogue come to Jesus and say, "Well, you know, this guy's like worthy of you helping him because like he's a friend of the synagogue, he helped us build it, he thinks highly of our people, so you really need to help him." And just when Jesus is actually going to the house, the centurion has sent friends who say to him, "Oh, you don't need to come. I know that I'm a Gentile and that you Jews have like bad feelings about going to a Gentile's house, so I wouldn't ask that of you. And also, I know how authority works. You know, I'm over 100 soldiers, and whenever I say jump, they all say, 'How high?' And I know that you have that kind of authority too, and I know that all you need to do is say, 'Be healed,' and my servant's going to be healed, so you just say the word and it's going to happen." And Jesus says, "I haven't seen faith like this in Israel, and this guy's a Gentile." So there's that theme, right? Surprise, surprise. Gentiles can actually be faithful people. So that'll be one of the themes of the book of Ruth that we'll want to take a look at. Now let's see how chapter 1 ends. Remember, we have Ruth going back to Israel after having been in Moab. Her husband's died. her sons, both of her two sons, Moabite husbands, have died, so now we have 3 widows. They're heading back to Israel. Ruth has told her both daughters-in-law, you actually need to stay here. You'll be better off here. You'll find husbands here. I'll go back alone, bereft. Yeah. Naomi, yes. I'm sorry. Thank you, Scotty, for that clarification. So Naomi's heading back, and she doesn't want her 2 daughters-in-law to go with her. That's when Ruth, as we looked at last week, right, says this, "For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and my God, your God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Remember, I said that this is sort of, Ruth now becomes an example of this really unique word, hesed, which describes God's kind of covenant-loving faithfulness. Ruth now becomes kind of an example of what that looks like. Remember, I said last time that the reason why I was going to use hesed is because it doesn't have the emotional connotation that the English word love does. That is, hesed here essentially is not romantic feelings or feelings of like, or, you're looking at someone and your heart starts to go pitter-patter. Rather, hesed is a form of action. It's loving, faithful action towards someone or some people. It's the word that describes the love that God practices toward the people of Israel. And now we're seeing it here in the person of Ruth, right? She says, well, yes, I realize that I'm not of your people. I'm a Gentile. But I'm going with you. I'm not going to let you go without me. And your people will become my people, your God will become my God, and where you die, I will die as well. That is, the idea right here is, notice here that the emphasis here is on this sort of like complete, total faithfulness of Ruth to Naomi. So that's where we left it off last time. So let's finish chapter 1, and then we'll get into chapter 2. So we picked this story up at 1:19. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem, which is where they were from originally. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred up because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem. Naomi is recognized by the women of the village. Look, it's Naomi. She's come back. And that's when Naomi kind of gives her own version of what I like to call her Job speech. That is, in effect, like Naomi kind of like has put herself in like the place of Job. I'm not suggesting that she had knew Job, but this is kind of what it sounds like. So notice what she says. First, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. So that's like my new identity, right? It's not simply that I've gone through some bitter things, right? But bitter has now become like my name. So if she showed up, at St. Peter's on Sunday morning, right, she'd have a name tag that would say, bitter. And that would let you know, like, not to talk to her, right? So this is how her identity. And notice the reason why, because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Now, at one level, right, that seems to be true. Okay, famine in the land, goes to Moab, husband dies, both son-in-laws die. Now she's bereft, she's a widow. Her daughter-in-laws are widows as well. And now she's come back and she faces an uncertain future. And that's another question we're going to want to take a look at in a minute, right? The question that's like hanging around here is, how are they going to survive? How are Ruth and Naomi going to survive? Because they don't have husbands. But The question right here now is this true? Is it really the case that God has dealt bitterly with Naomi Mara? And right away, right, the reader at least knows that that's actually not the case. If for only like one reason, right? Naomi Mara hasn't lost everything. She does have Ruth. Only clearly she's not thinking about Ruth as like a benefit or an asset at this point. Right? So this is a really important question that the book of Ruth raises, right? We often kind of have ideas about God having not treated us the way we wanted to be treated, and da-da-da-da-da-da. The question, right, is, well, are we missing something? Is there something, maybe some blessing that is there that we're just forgetting, or that we haven't seen, or that we've like overlooked? That's a question here for Ruth. That is, Ruth is kind of like standing there, right? Naomi is sort of standing there, and Ruth is sort of standing next to her. And Naomi is kind of going into this sort of long speech, I'm all alone in the world. I don't have anybody. I'm like totally bereft of human society and support and help, and woe is me, and and like Ruth is standing like right there. So right away, right, we're being tipped off that what Naomi Mara says about herself actually isn't true. So part of the dynamic of the story, right, and we'll want to watch this, right? How does Naomi's outlook on things change over the course of the story? That'll be one of the things we'll want to watch for. So that's basically how the first chapter ends. So let's take a look at the second chapter. So second chapter, right? Dramatic question hanging in the air. How are these two women going to survive? They couldn't apply for jobs at Walmart or anything like that. Okay, so how are they going to survive? So let's see how that comes about. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, her husband, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Now, two things here that we just want to kind of think about, right? Notice once again, right? How are we going to survive? It's Ruth, as the story emphasizes, Ruth the Moabite says to her mother-in-law, Naomi, "Here's what we'll do. I will go and glean from your relative Boaz's field." Now let me say a word here about gleaning, or better yet, I'll just kind of read you. This is there's a provision for gleaning in the book of Deuteronomy. It's actually Deuteronomy 24:17 to 22. So I'll read it to you. Here it is. "You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. When you reap your harvest in your field, and you forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow. When you gather grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and therefore I command you to do this." So notice here a couple things about gleaning that we just want to keep in mind. In effect, right, Israel had what you might call, in modern day parlance, this is kind of anachronistic, but it's probably the best we can do. Israel kind of had its own sort of like social welfare system. in a way, right? Now it didn't have there was no social welfare office or something like that, right? But rather, the idea here is that God tells the people of Israel, okay, when you harvest, you can't harvest everything. You have to kind of leave some stuff behind, and that's for the widow, the orphan, and the fatherless, the weakest people in society. And there's sort of like two things that are going on here about why this not only can happen, but did you notice it must happen? It's like not optional. You might want to allow them to glean if you're feeling generous. No, you must. You have to do this. Two things that we want to kind of take a notice here that kind of define gleaning. Thing number one, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, where you were abused. Nobody really thought much of you, right? You were kind of like free labor. And if 100 of y'all died building a pyramid, well, so what? Dispensable labor, right? Plenty more where that came from. Doesn't matter. So, in effect, God says to the people of Israel, okay, well, look, remember what it was like to be vulnerable. Like a widow, like an orphan, or like a sojourner, right? Don't turn around and do to the vulnerable people in your land what the Egyptians did to you. That's kind of the idea here. There's a second thing that's going on here that we also want to be aware of, and it's sort of like underneath all this and is equally important. It's the whole theology of creation. That is, the idea here is that where does the harvest come from? Whether it's barley or grapes or olives or whatever, right? Where does the harvest come from? Well, of course, ultimately, the harvest comes from creation, right? Try running a successful vineyard on the surface of Venus and see how far you get. That is, the idea right here is, well, because the harvest comes from creation, who owns creation? God. And therefore, right, this is a way of teaching the people of Israel, right, to remember, right, okay, well, yeah, you planted that vineyard and you did all kinds of stuff to it, but ultimately, right, what comes out of that vineyard is the fruit of creation and really belongs to the Creator. Okay? Now, when harvest time comes, right, you're gonna make an offering to God, right? God's gonna ask for 10% of His harvest, and He's gonna allow you to keep 90%, which is a pretty good deal when you think about it, right? So that's the other thing that's going on here. So Ruth here volunteers to go and glean. Okay, so that's the premise of the story, and notice what happens next. So Ruth is hoping to find favor in Boaz's sight, and so Naomi says, okay, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Why don't you go do that? So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And we probably want to put the word "happened" here in quotations, right? She just happened to end up in the field belonging to Boaz. Well, there's no it just happened about it, right? This is clearly providence at work. So it didn't just merely occur. And behold, Boaz came forth from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Okay, so notice here, right? Under normal circumstances, that's as far as things would go. Okay, Boaz has found out that Ruth is there. She's related to Naomi. She's there gleaning. Boaz knows the provision of the law of Moses, and so that should have been the end of it, right? Yep, she's okay. This is allowed by the law of Moses. Yep, I'm glad to know that she's out there. Hope she does well. End of story, and everybody goes home happy. Well, of course, that's not the end of the story. Now, notice this, right? And here we want to think about, once again, we want to think about our word hesed, covenant-loving faithfulness, because we're about to see Boaz as an example of it. Okay, so here we go. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessel and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell down on her face, bowing to the ground, and she said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" Now, notice that question, right? Boaz says, okay, I know who you are, and here's what I want you to do. First of all, I want you to stay in my field with the women from my family. They'll watch over you. And by the way, I've kind of instructed them that as they're harvesting, they're not to be too efficient. That is, Boaz in effect has instructed them to deliberately leave more than enough behind for Ruth to glean. And then he's going, by the way, it's hot out here. If you get thirsty, there's a water station over there. Whenever you're thirsty, you just go over there and drink from the water that my young men have drawn from the well. So things are sounding pretty good. And that's when Ruth asks this question, "Why have I found favor in your eyes?" Now, in many ways, right, that's a question posed by a foreigner to an Israelite, Ruth to Boaz, right? But in some ways, right, this is also a question that could be addressed by Israel to God. Why have I found favor in your sight, right? Why are we your covenant people? How did that work out? We didn't apply, and we certainly didn't we certainly weren't doing such a great job that you looked at us and say, yeah, those have to be my people because they're so wonderful. So that's the question, right? Why have I found favor in your eyes? And I think Boaz's answer is interesting. This is in Ruth 2:11. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land, and you have come to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." That is, Boaz says to Ruth, once again, this foreigner, this Moabite, he says, in effect, I know the story about what happened to you back in Moab. And I also know about how you have come back here with your mother-in-law, and I also know the story of your complete commitment to her. And in you, I see a glimpse of the commitment that God has made to us, his people. And that's why I'm doing this to you, right? I see God's hesed reflected in you, and so now I'm going to respond. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So notice here, another really important kind of theme, right? We don't want to separate the hesed that God shows his people from the hesed that his people can show to one another, right? That's the important idea behind, remember, the story of the expert in the law, remember, who comes to Jesus and says, "Oh, Rabbi, I heard that you had a diploma from Harvard Law School. I've got like a question I want to ask you," okay? And of course, it's a trick question. What is the greatest commandment? Now, we have a sense here, right, that this is not really like the most honest of questions, right? This is sort of like the sort of the motivation behind the question, right, is what's the least that we have to do to still consider ourselves faithful members of the covenant, right? And if you're asking that question, right, you've like flunked out, okay? And so remember what he says. Okay, what's like the greatest commandment? Like, what's the one that we really have to keep? And maybe we can like let the other ones slide. Every time I think about this, a number of years ago there was a cartoon series in this journal called Christian Leadership, and it was a series of cartoons that detailed the competition between two churches that were next door to one another. And the one was kind of like a smallish, kind of like little colonial structure, and the one next to it was this huge Gothic building. And there was like this ongoing battle between them, back and forth for different things. And the cartoon series ends with, or the penultimate cartoon in the series has the smaller church kind of like clearly competing for members. And so on their sign out front, they have, they have the name of the church, and then they have Home of the 5 Commandments, in parentheses, your choice, and the 3% tithe. So this is kind of like the lawyer, right? I want to find the church, the 5 commandments and the 3% tithe. And then I have to say this, right? The last cartoon in the series has the small church now with the new sign that says, half the size, twice as righteous as the place next door. But anyway, so we have Boaz now responding to Ruth in this way. And then in verse 13, then she said, this is what Ruth says to Boaz in return, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." Now, here another little important episode occurs, and this is probably where we'll probably need to stop. So something else happens that is also like totally unexpected and is another sign of Hesed. And here it is. "And at mealtime, Boaz said to her," now remember, right, she's only supposed to be gleaning, and the provision for water is like really generous, but not strictly necessary. And what comes next is really, really not necessary. "And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine.' So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied and had some left over. And when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also put out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her.'" So a couple of really generous things happening that we just want to kind of take a notice of. So thing number one, Boaz invites Ruth basically to lunch and spreads out this kind of interesting meal before her. And a really important note that we don't want to miss. "And she ate until she was satisfied." Now, one guesses, right, from the context of everything that's happened, it's probably been a long, long time since that happened to Ruth. Since she ate a meal until she was satisfied, right? Now, I want you to kind of think about something for just a minute, or maybe two things. Think back to some of Jesus' feeding miracles in the Gospels. Remember what happens in all of them, right? There's a crowd, 5,000, 6,000, it doesn't really make any difference. The whole crowd's fed, right? And two things are always mentioned about the crowd, right? Everyone ate until they were satisfied. And good news for all of you who are responsible for the cooking in your household, right? There were leftovers. There's always leftover, right? Meaning, right, that everyone sits down, everyone kind of like, it's kind of like Thanksgiving dinner, everyone eats a little bit extra and they're all like nicely full, and there are leftovers. It's about God's generosity, right? And so once again, right here, we're being told, right, that Ruth here is experiencing the generosity of God through Boaz. But there's another thing we want to mention here, and as I said, this is probably where we need to stop. We have this meal in which God's kind of like hesed, covenant-loving faithfulness, is manifested. And I think we want to kind of use this opportunity to think about another meal in which that hesed is manifested. It's a meal that we eat here every Sunday called the Eucharist. And I just want to kind of plant an idea in your mind about what this might look like and how the two might be related. So I'm going to read to you part of Paul's instruction to the church in Corinth about this meal, and just kind of see if you can draw some similarities. So the idea right here is that in the upper room, remember, Jesus does something that probably would have shocked the disciples, in the sense that he tells them that this bread and this wine are in some sense me, and I'm handing it over to you for you to benefit from, right? In effect, right, this bread and this wine is in some ways that you don't understand yet, and the church is going to be spending, the next 2,000 years talking about and still not get. I want you to know that I'm not just handing you some bread and some wine, I'm handing over to you me and all that I represent. It's your gift. Okay, so here's Paul's instruction to the church in Corinth about this meal. And of course, right, Paul's doing this against the background of infighting in the Corinthian church and lots of egos that need to be placated, and controversy and division and backbiting and gossip and power plays and ill feeling. Thank goodness we have none of that today. All that's gone. So you may need to exercise your imaginations in thinking about what things were like in Corinth, but here it goes. Notice, right, what Paul says to them is exactly what they need to hear. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you. Notice this is what I've already told you about this thing called the Eucharist. Now I'm going to tell you again. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, took bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it, and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, also he took a cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often you drink it in remembrance of me." And that's where the quotations stop. By the way, in Greek there are no quotations, but so scholars have to kind of guess that that's what it is. And then Paul adds a comment of his own, almost in parentheses, and unfortunately in Greek there are no parentheses, but if there were, Paul would have used parentheses. Right? This little bit, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. That is, notice what Paul's reminding them, right? Look, divided church, gossiping church, backbiting church, divided church, arguing church, egotistical church. Every time you eat this meal, you are at least proclaiming and receiving the almighty hesed of God, poured out for you in Jesus' death and resurrection. And Paul's in effect saying to the church, right, okay, let's think about this a little bit. Okay, let's think about what this meal says, and let's think about where you are, and let's see if something needs to change, right? So I think we're getting this sort of powerful theme of God's covenant-loving faithfulness coming out in all kinds of ways in Ruth. I'll finish here chapter 2 just by saying this. As the story comes to an end, we're told something also really important about Boaz. And this occurs in Ruth 2:20. We're told that Boaz is a redeemer. Really important word, and I'll say more about that next week. But just for now, once again, right, we just want to remember two things about this really important word, redeemer. I'll say something about its New Testament meaning next Sunday, but for now, we just want to notice, right, remember what God tells Moses right at the beginning of the book of Exodus. God tells Moses that he is going to redeem the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And therefore, right, in the Old Testament, right, God becomes the Redeemer, capital R, of Israel. Meaning, right, something very specific. A Redeemer is someone who does something for someone else who's in bondage or captivity and can't help themselves, to get them out of wherever they are. We're learning here that that's how we're to understand Boaz's role. Boaz is going to do something for someone who cannot do something for themselves and bring them out of one situation, a really bad one, into a much better one. And in doing that, right, we'll see reflected God's covenant-loving faithfulness. Okay, so we'll pick that up, and then we'll do Ruth 3 next Sunday as well. Yeah, and we'll find out there's some jostling back and forth about that. There actually is a closer relative who's offered the opportunity to be the Redeemer, and that guy turns it down. Boo hiss, boo hiss. And then Boaz takes it on. Go Boaz.